There's a good chance that we have misunderstood how old Moshe Rabbeinu was when he was taken back to Paro's palace as a so-called child. Rashi will illustrate to us how we make this mistake, and in doing so will say that there are two key factors to Moshe's development, and those two key factors speak to the two primary elements of his spiritual power and influence. Fun pasuk, taking out of the pasuk that says Vayhi bayom v'ahem, and it was at that time Vayidal Moshe v'yetzer gomer. Moshe grew up and he went out to his brothers and he saw that there was a taskmaster beating a Jewish man. Vayachas hamitri gomer, and he killed the taskmaster. So out of that entire pasuk is Rashi Matik Deverta. Rashi extracts the words Vayidal Moshe, that Moshe grew up or matured, on his mefarish, and he explains as follows. Doesn't it already tell us earlier that he as a child had grown up? Implying, why say it again? So therefore he quotes an answer that the first time describes him growing in height and the second time in stature and prestige. What's the prestige? That Paro appointed him to have responsibility and authority within his home. So what's bothering Rashi? What would seem simply to be Rashi's issue is the same question the Medrash has. The Torah has already told me about Moshe that he grew up. Why does the pasuk say, and Moshe grew up again? So to that Rashi answers, so apparently Rashi's answering that question by saying, well, the first time was describing height and the other was describing prestige and honor. At first glimpse, you may have been happy with that answer, but the truth is it actually really doesn't work. Because the Friedeke pasuk, the first pasuk that says that Moshe grew up, is in the immediate context of that his mother took him and nursed him. Which obviously means bepashtos, that if it says then that he grew up, it means he grew up relative to the age of being nursed, which is typically 24 months maximum. As dennoch is vayigdal hayeled. After that, he grew up to become a child who was no longer dependent on his mother. He doesn't need to be nursed, which would explain why he was then taken by Paro's daughter to the palace. So that makes perfect sense in context. Now in this pasuk, after he's already been taken to the palace, where we're told that he grows up, it's obviously a different stage of his development, a stage where he's grown up to the point that he could go and attack an Egyptian taskmaster. Surely that's a long time after he was taken to the palace. So why is it so difficult to imagine that the pasuk says twice, and he grew up? The first time he grew up from being a child who was nursed to being a toddler, and the second time from being a child to becoming a teen or a young adult or whatever it was who could stand up for his people. So it cannot just simply be that Rashi's bothered by the double language, because the double language actually makes sense. In addition to which, there are a number of questions about how Rashi words his interpretation as well. In them, Pirush Rashi Gufa Daf Verstehen, 5 things we have to understand. Number 1, Aleph. The derech von Rashi Pirusha is the nature of how Rashi constructs his commentary is vigeret filmol, something we've discussed numerous times. Nit zu oisteichen free the Schwierigkeiten Posuk und noch verentfern. He does not typically first tell us what the problem is and then offer the solution to the problem. Nor as bald mevord and Posuk mevard and Posuk bederech memelet vet fein for tishal and Posuk. Usually the way Rashi does it is he gets straight into his commentary, which addresses whatever question we would have seen that Rashi had on the pasuk. So why here does Rashi feel that he has to tell us the question that's bothering him? Surely we could work it out. Second of all, Beis. Why is it specifically that when he describes the growth from being a child who was nursing, he dafka describes growth in height? From the time that a child is weaned, all of his external limbs grow. And not only that, besides that, he grows in size and in weight. And he develops the capacity for speech. His mind matures. Out of all of those things, why would Rashi dafke highlight specifically the fact that he grew in height? Why is that such a big deal? Number 3, Rashi says that Paro appointed him over his home. Where does he get that from? Gimel. From Vanet is the Hechech in Pshutish on Mikra from the Pasuk. Where in the simple understanding of this Pasuk is there any indication as the Gadas Vachshuvas from Moshe is Bashana in Dembas Minho Paro al Beisai, that the greatness of Moshe is associated with being given authority within Paro's home? Where do you see that? Especially when you consider where the pasuk is going, that Moshe then goes to see what's happening with his brothers, is mashmas is given a gadus b'shaychas echav. So the logic would say, as many of the commentaries do say, that his greatness was taking responsibility for his brethren, Sudiyid, his fellow Jews. As the Medrash says. Daled, a technical question about the heading that Rashi uses. At this point, we're saying that Rashi's big issue is why the word Vayigdal is mentioned for a second time, so soon after the first time, in the story of Moshe, which is unnecessary. How come then does Rashi include not only the word Vayigdal as his heading, which is the word he looks to explain, but also the word Moshe, which it doesn't look like he's trying to explain? And lastly, of course, why do we have to know who said this teaching about the greatness of Moshe? We've discussed numerous times that the only time Rashi will quote the name of a source is only on the machen glatter. It's either to answer or to clarify a higher grade question that a more advanced student would ask. So in that case, we have to wonder, what added dimension of understanding will we get in this entire story, knowing that Rabbi Huda Rabbi Eloi was the person who said it? So, perhaps this is the answer. As Rashi wants to be clear as the Vayigdal in unser Pasuk, that the word Vayigdal in our Pasuk cannot just be the growth that happens over the course of time. So, not the same kind of growth. This Vayigdal is not the same category of growth that happened in the previous pasuk, where we're saying over a period of time he grew older and maturer. As is i.e. that a few years had passed. That's not what we're trying to say over here. Because it doesn't really make sense that the Torah should use such an open-ended expression. He grew up, and without telling us, and it implies that a certain amount of time went by, without giving us any clue of how much time. Therefore, Rashi says, it can't be telling us X amount of years passed. It must imply that the greatness here is not growing up, but growing prestigious. Okay, maybe that's part of the answer, but das is nicht masbik, but it's not a good enough answer, for a couple of reasons, or 3 reasons. Number 1, Aleph. If all Rashi wants to do for us is define what the word Vayigdal means in this pasuk, why does Rashi have to bring up the previous pasuk? Why, which sounds like he's saying, why does the Torah repeat itself? Considering that Rashi is not explaining why Vayigdal is said twice, according to that explanation, but rather he's just defining what the word Vayigdal means in the context of our pasuk. So leave the previous pasuk, don't mention it, don't bring it up, just say Vayigdal here means Gedula. Second of all, Beis, the Birif and Hashem Vayigdal Hayeled as dos meint lekoimo is Iberik. If Rashi's intention is only to explain over here that the word Vayigdal means that he grew in greatness, then what he comments about the previous Vayigdal, that it means he grew in size, is completely irrelevant. Surely all Rashi should be concerned with is what the Vayigdal in our pasuk means. He doesn't have to use this pasuk to translate what the previous pasuk meant. All he needs to tell us is in this pasuk, it means that he became a greater person because Paro gave him responsibilities around the house. Gimel, lastly, as that Tzveita Vayigdal is menegech shivas vegados legedula, if it is true that all Rashi wants us to know is that the word Vayigdal means that Moshe had grown in stature, the truth is, we don't need Rashi to explain that to us. We have precedent in the Torah where we see a person first grows in age and then he grows in greatness. We have that in the case of Yitzchak, where it also says Vayigdal twice. First we're told, almost exactly like here, the child grew up, Yitzchak, and he was weaned. like Moshe was weaned, according to the first pasuk. And then and then there's another description of how Yitzchak Avinu grew and became very great. And the implication of there is not age. Was der erste Vayigdal is in Zman. So the first one is describing a passage of time that he grew and outgrew nursing. And Vayigdal, Bizas Vayigomal, to the point that he was weaned. On that zweite Vayigdal is a movement from Gadus bin Echosim v'Chayotze, and it's very clear in the pasuk that the second Vayigdal is talking about greatness in terms of his wealth and his influence. The pasuk says, he had many flocks and he had great wealth. To the extent that, as Rashi points out, that people would have preferred to have the fertilizer produced by his flocks than the wealth and treasures of Avimelech. So if we know already in the case of Yitzchak that you could describe the same person as growing once age-wise and the other time greatness-wise, when I say we could know the same thing applies to Moshe, and Rashi doesn't have to tell us about it. So what we're going to discover is that Rashi is actually using this as an opportunity to explain the previous Vayigdal more than he is explaining this one, because we have a misunderstanding of how old Moshe was when he was taken back to Paro's palace. So the hinge over here is the pasuk zogt vayihi bayomim mohim vayigdal Moshe. The pasuk doesn't just say Moshe grew older or became greater. It says it was in those days. Those days is an important reference. Which days? Because this is so close after the pasuk that says that Moshe had grown up to the point that he was weaned, it must mean Bayomim Ahim of those days, as Vayigdal Moshe is given Bayomim Ahim from freer. This other reference to Moshe growing must also be in that time period. No ensumsman from Vayigdal Hayelet Vaitfeil Basparo Vayilo Lebein, in close proximity to the age at which Moshe was taken by Basparo back to her palace and considered like her child. So if that's true, as the Pirish from Vayigdal Moshe is Gedula B'Chashivos. Well, back then you're telling me that Moshe became a great, prestigious person. He was a kid. As in the Yomim Mahim from Vayigdal Hayelet. It doesn't make any sense that in the time frame by Yomim Mahim referred to in the previous pasuk of when he grew up, meaning Noch die Tag von Siyum Zman HaYenika, just soon after he had been weaned from nursing. Is Vayigdal Moshe the Gedula? At that age he becomes a great, prestigious individual? Doesn't make sense. The Rebbe is Rashi Meforsh, therefore Rashi has to tell us that the first Vayigdal is the one we misinterpreted. We just thought Vayigdal meant he was old enough not to be nursed anymore. It means more than that. Horishan Lekoima. The first growth that's described is growth in height. Vasheni Legdul, and the second is in greatness. In other words, the Ikar Chidish in them is nit men again the Vayigdal for unser Pasuk. Rashi's big insight over here is not about the word Vayigdal in our Pasuk, V'hasheni L'Gdula, which describes that he became great, nor as the Vayigdal from Friedrich in Pasuk meint L'Koima. The main innovation of Rashi here is to tell us that the first Pasuk that said Vayigdal was referring specifically to height, not general growth. Vayigdal Hayeled meint nitim Gidul was noch in Zman Hayenika. It's not describing the period immediately after him being weaned, via Zetais Vashkafir Rishona, which is what we would have thought. No, Lekoima, specifically an age at which a person starts to gain height. When a kid wächst aus und wird a Gott became a kipshuta, when a kid actually becomes tall. Was das mit am Meshech Yoren nach dem Zman von Vayigomal. Rashi is highlighting over here that Vayigdal is actually referring to years later, long after he had been weaned, when he starts to become a tall child. You're going to say, so why call him a child? And those was ervet noch halt Songruf and Yeled is came to me, and it's not such a big deal that we call somebody who's already older still a child. We find, for example, Reuven referred to Yosef at 17 years old as a child. Or when they were arguing about, he said, I told you not to harm the child. He calls him the child. He was 17 years old. We find it as well with Binyamin, that Binyamin is referred to as a child when he's close to 30 years old. So it's not far-fetched to say that you refer to somebody as a child when they're already older. But what's relevant to our understanding of the whole timeline is if Harishan, the first time it says Vayigdal, is referring to his height. Well, if he's old enough to already become tall, he could also have some kind of prestige at that age. The second one, the second Vayigdal, goes hand in hand with the first Vayigdal. Because the first Vayigdal is telling us that he's already a preteen or maybe a teen, so now we know that he could actually have greatness at that point in time, and that's what Rashi wants to tell us. That's why Rashi, to get this point across, has to first explain the question. Doesn't it already tell us that he grew? Is because that's actually the part that Rashi wants to focus on, because that's where his real chiddush is. Now that the Torah has repeated Vayigdal Moshe, that reconstitutes our translation and understanding of the original Vayigdal. So I have to tell you about the original Vayigdal so that you see that shift. Now you're going to say, all right, what? How does this all work? How did he not come back to Paro's palace straight after being weaned? I mean, wasn't the whole reason that Batya allowed him to go to his mother, not knowing it was his mother, was only in order to nurse him? So Lacher came and Freged, you should be able to ask him about as Bas Paro hot them Paro's daughter's entire intention of handing over the baby was so that he should be fed for those 24 months. Is wie kommt es, was sie hat der Lust, men soll ihm zurückbringen, erst nachdem, wer es ausgewachsen bekäme. Then how, according to Rashi, could she have allowed the delay of the return of this baby to her till he was no longer a baby? He was already a grown boy. Which, as we've pointed out, is years later. How did she have the patience for so many years? Surely she wanted her baby that she had found. It's actually a really simple explanation. If she cared enough about that baby, she would have accepted the excuses given by the nursing woman, who was actually the mother of the baby. Moshe, Yocheved now has her son Moshe in her hands. You can be sure she was not going to hand Moshe over to Bas Paro straight away as soon as he had been weaned. Needless to say, she would hold on to her own child as long as is possible after the time of having weaned him. And how would she do that? With all kinds of very rational arguments. The child is used to me. He's become close to me. It's not good. It's not healthy for him to rip him away from me and take him to the palace. He's still young. He's still impressionable. He needs to be in an environment that feels safe for him. And if Paro's daughter cared enough about Moshe, she would accept that rational argument. But once he was tall enough that he started to look like a young man, those arguments no longer would work, and she'd have no choice but to send him back to Paro's daughter. So if that's true, let's still try and understand. If Paro's daughter obviously wanted this child to be in her home, that's why she took him in the first place. Is moving as gekent verhalten, nor bis wann es kann sein gültig der Tam war Masla Hanel. So as we've explained, Yocheved could only delay that process as long as she could justify a reason for Moshe to stay with her. As far an Yeled is wichtig zu bleiben bei dem Menekes v'chulei, by arguing that it's better for the child to be with me, because of the bond that we have established. So other arguments like that. Was das ist bis in Gil von Ben Chamesh v'Sheish l'chol ha'yosef b'shtadlus yesera bis zum Gil von Yalad v'Yud Beishana. So how long could she have pushed this? Probably 5 or 6 years, or with tremendous, and never underestimate the power of a Jewish mother, tremendous effort, 11, 12 years old. If that's true, so what, he becomes a leader in Paro's house at 11, 12 years old? You're going to tell me that at that young age he's already a big deal in Paro's house? How's that possible? Rashi explains. That's why he tells us firstly what the role was, and he includes the word Moshe in the headline. The Faris Rashi explains as the Gedula Bashtaten Dembas Minaya Parallel Beisai. Let's first qualify what the greatness was. It was authority and responsibility in Paro's home. Says it's not like he became a member of the government or had authority over the country. Melucha. It was a personal thing in Paro's house where he was given certain roles. That kind of greatness or that kind of appointment could even happen to a person while they're still quite young, if there is, of course, a compelling reason to appoint that person to that position, and we'll examine that compelling reason shortly. A great example of that is Yosef, who's a teenager and running the household of one of the most prominent ministers in Paro's kingdom at that time, Potiphar. So what is the compelling reason here? What prompted Paro to be willing to give Moshe that kind of responsibility in his home when he was so young? Rashi resolves that by including in his header not only the word Vayigdal, which is the obvious word we're trying to understand, but also the word Moshe, which gives insight into the Vayigdal, why he became great. And in doing so, Rashi actually tackles another question we should have asked about why the word Moshe is in the pasuk in the first place. Surely the word Moshe is completely superfluous in the pasuk. We know who we're talking about. Had it only said, and he grew. We know exactly who you're talking about because of the previous pasuk. We'd know you're talking about Moshe. So therefore we have no choice but to explain as the time was the pasuk is done for them nomen Moshe. Why does the Torah include the name Moshe over here in this pasuk? Is the adgosha for Vayisofah for nomen. It's because by knowing his name Moshe, when das is nit muchrach, when it doesn't have to be part of the sentence, you mention something you don't have to mention when it is beloved to you. You look for a reason to mention. Moshe, especially in this context, the name Moshe was the mantas vas Paro min hamayim shisuhu. That's the name that reminds us that Bas Paro grabbed him and schlepped him out of the water. Like the Gemara tells us, there was a great miracle. Her arm extended miraculously to reach him. So he is very precious to her. Knowing that Moshe is precious to Bas Paro helps us understand how he suddenly gets a position in the family. Dos meint Vayigdal Moshe. That's why it says Moshe became great. Dos is a gadlus was gekommen mit chavivus. He was given greatness within the family because he was so cherished by the family, or at least by Paro's daughter. So Moshe's chavivus and asiyas chaim by Bas Paro biz as vayhilo leben. Because Moshe found so much favor in Paro's daughter's eyes, to the extent that she adopted him as a son, she obviously influenced her father to give him some prestigious role within the family. And again, similar to how things go with Yosef. Because he had this appeal to Potiphar, that's why Potiphar appointed him with authority over his home. Regardless of the fact that he didn't qualify because he was young and he came from the wrong tribe and he was a slave. Same kind of thing happens with Moshe. It doesn't matter where he came from, it doesn't matter. Because Bas Paro finds him to be somebody precious, therefore he gets a role in the family. And just to make it even easier for us to swallow, that it is appropriate to give somebody a position that they don't necessarily deserve because you find them to be beloved to you. Especially because Yosef's example is not exactly the same as Moshe's example for a simple reason. Yosef is a kol ponim alt given 17, 18 year. Yosef, at the time he was given the responsibilities, was at least an older teenager. Whereas Moshe was a new teenager, maybe even a preteen. So to explain how a young person, somebody who doesn't necessarily deserve a position, gets it anyway, as Rashi so Rashi tells us, well, look who said it, Rabbi Yehuda ber Rabbi Eloi, who was calling on his own personal experience. Because when Rabbi Yehuda read that in Gemara, the Gemara tells us about Rabbi Yehuda ber Rabbi Eloi as it is given a grosser oni, that it was incredibly impoverished. So much so, he and his wife had to share one outer garment to wear in public. And therefore, so So there was a story the Gemara tells us. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel declared a public fast, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Eloi could not participate in the communal prayers because he didn't have clothing to wear to be able to go. So he's an incredibly poor person. Typically, poor people are not people who are given positions of power and leadership. And yet the Gemara tells us, as the case that the head, the Roman emperor, put Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi as the spokesperson of the entire Jewish people. He was like the representative of not only of the rabbis, but of the Nasi. The Caesar appointed him to be the head of the house of the Nasi, which is the highest position in the Jewish community. Even though he's so poor. Why is that? If you look at Rabbi Yehuda from an outward appearance and the circumstances of his life, given in Atzirvas is neat, in the Ege from Malchus, he doesn't appear to have the profile of somebody that the royalty would appoint into a position of authority. Okay, now is given a grace man, especially when you consider that he was not only poor, but he was even considered poor compared to poor people. And nevertheless, because the king obviously liked something about him, found him to be a unique human being, he is dafka the one who was appointed as the spokesperson and the representative of the Beis Nasi to the king. So Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi is calling on his own experience, and he says, when somebody finds you to be valuable, they upgrade you to a level that you don't necessarily deserve. And the same would apply here. As Moshe is noch young ganar, even though Moshe is very young at this point, but because of the greatness he has, which is Zayin de Kazechoviv Babas Paroi, that he is so beloved to Paro's daughter, to the point that she rescued him from the water and adopted him as a son. That's why he achieved such prestige in Paro's family and was given a position of authority. So that we really answer all of the questions. We misunderstood how young or old Moshe was when he went to Paro's palace. We misunderstood what Rashi was focused on. It was actually explaining the first Vayigdal. It was giving us context and Moshe, and we have an insight now that Moshe gets this incredible position even though he's way too young for it. Let's translate all of that into a spiritual insight into the persona of Moshe Rabbeinu. So the deeper perspective that Rashi offers us is like this. Whatever happens in the world, and in this context, whatever happens with Moshe Rabbeinu in physical terms, are all an evolution of the same spiritual reality that causes these things to happen. And if that's true of anything, then it certainly is true of Moshe Rabbeinu, who even as a human on earth, lived with the same spiritual reality that he did before his neshama descended. Why is that? Because he's a neshama d'Atzilus. He's the highest breed of neshama that you can get, a neshama that lives still in the world of complete oneness with Hashem, the world of Atzilus. So if that's true generally of Moshe, it will apply specifically to our scenario. As in now that we've described that there are two elements to Moshe Rabbeinu's growth, the first is physical stature, physical height. And the second speaks to a role that he played in Paro's house. They actually represent the two key elements of Moshe Rabbeinu's spiritual makeup. To understand that, let's have a look at the Zohar. So we'll understand it based on the pasuk that describes Moshe's birth, which says that she became pregnant and had a son, and she saw that son was good. So the Zohar quotes a debate between two of the Kabbalists as to what exactly did she see that was so good and unique about Moshe Rabbeinu. So Rabbi Chia says what she saw is that he was born already circumcised. On Rabbi Yossi, whereas Rabbi Yossi explains that Nehira Deshchinta Denore Bechamos, she saw the divine presence glowing on him. Because at the time that he was born, the whole house was filled with light. Concludes the Zohar, that's why the pasuk says Kitoivu, and all of the above applied. In other words, he was both born circumcised and he was born filling the house with light. Says Mevoyer and Erachamo, one of the commentaries on the Zohar, as Machlekes Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi is nitin metzius. That the argument between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi is not that it's one or the other that we're true. Beida halten as Moshe and Zayne given beide inyonim. They both acknowledge that both the fact that Moshe was born with a bris and the fact that the house was filled with light actually happened. Noilad mol und hier de Schinte. The Machlekes is nur was hat Yocheved gesehen madgish given. All they're debating is what was the property that Yocheved noted, saw, and shared. Now we've got to ask ourselves, what would lie behind their two different opinions? Favos halt Rabbi Chia dis yaled mol, and Rabbi Yossi hasn't heard the Schinte denor by Chamos. Why is that Rabbi Chia focuses on the fact that he had a bris and Rabbi Yossi on the fact that the house was filled with the light of the Shekhinah? So Rabbi Leivik explains in his commentary on the Zohar that Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi were speaking from the perspective of their respective spiritual realities. Rabbi Chia was Eres Bechinas Yesod. Rabbi Chia, who is in a sense a higher spiritual reality, the level of Yesod within Atzilus. So he focuses on the bris because the bris is related to the energy of Yesod. It's a part of the human anatomy that is associated with relationship, with bonding, and that is the nature of Yesod. On Rabbi Yossi Bechinas Malchus, Rabbi Yossi, who is in a different spiritual reality, he lives in the world of Malchus. So he focuses on the fact that the Shekhinah, divine presence, was there because the Shekhinah is the dimension of Malchus. On the Siyam in Zohar, the way the Zohar concludes the conversation about that that's what the pasuk means when it says Kitov, and both of them replied, is nit von Divrei Rabbi Yossi. That's not Rabbi Yossi speaking at that point. Now the Stama von Zohar Firtois as is given by beide inyonim kenal uchidele kamon. The Zohar is concluding and clarifying for us that actually both opinions are valid. The Asbore Noisis Pshuto says, let's try and understand this in more accessible terms. When we speak about the greatness of Moshe, we'll find two areas of greatness. There is Moshe's greatness as Moshe Rabbeinu. He is, as the Rambam describes, the most incredible human being who ever lived. He's completely aloof from anything to do with this world. He's completely connected and one with Hashem. When he opens his mouth, the divine presence speaks. That is one reality of Moshe. Then there's another reality of Moshe, and that is that he is the exceptional shepherd of the Jewish people. Which means that he supplied everything the Jewish people needed materially and spiritually. And through the Jewish people actually brought bracha to the entire world. And obviously that implies that Moshe has to step out and step down from his very deep, profound spiritual reality in order to be able to engage the world. Both of these incredible properties of Moshe Rabbeinu were evident as he was born. Like the Medrash says, Moshe Hayaroyeh. You could translate that as he was shepherding, or he was a shepherd, says the Medrash. Right from the beginning, when he was born, he was already suited to be this shepherd of souls. That is represented in the two things that Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yossi describe about the so-called beauty and goodness of Moshe's birth. The fact that we say Moshe was born already bris, describes that Moshe, in and of himself, is at an incredibly high level. A way that he lives in a completely supernatural reality, because it's not natural to be born that way. To be born already circumcised is not natural. And therefore, what does that mean? That means that his nefesh lekis shone so brightly right through his whole reality, whereas without the barriers represented by the foreskin, which represents the concealment of the Yetzer Hara. He had none of that. The neshama shines right through from day one. On the other hand, whereas Rabbi Yossi's opinion, which is that he drew into his world this light of the Shekhinah that then illuminated the whole house, that describes his greatness in terms of influence and impact on the entire world. On the Riber, now we can understand why Rabbi Chia goes for the bris and Rabbi Yossi goes for the Shekhinah. Because mitzad bechinas yesod was is ba'atzilas hechafan ivroim When you're looking from Rabbi Chia's perspective, the world of Atzilus, the level of Yesod, which is still within Atzilus, completely beyond the world, is a seich lamata b'avodas Hashem in an ofen as dika hamayla is dveikus v'skashus b'likus shleimus atzmoi. Then what you focus on is that to live in this world, the ultimate is to be completely connected to Hashem, even while you're in this world. In other words, to be the greatest of people. Moshe is born already with a bris, is the greatest of people. Das was mir is ausgetan und Herrscher von Welt. It illustrates the fact that he's completely not a citizen of the normal world. The Rebbe sagt Rabbi Chia, Bechinas Yesod, therefore Rabbi Chia, who represents that reality, says, as the Mali from Moshe was the Torah bringt heraus, that what is the Torah focused on over here, is das was the Yesial Mol Moshe's Mali Shleimus Liatzmoi. It's the fact that he was born with a bris, his personal greatness. But if you're looking from the perspective of Malchus, what is the role of Malchus? The role of Malchus is to allow other things to exist and to give them life. So then that's the kind of Avodas Hashem that is prioritized from a Malchus perspective. What is the greatness of a person's spirituality? Their ability to influence and touch and illuminate others. Und der Rebbe sagt Rabbi Yossi, Bechinas Malchus, therefore Rabbi Yossi, who lives in the reality of Malchus, says, as in Mari von Moshe hat sich angesehen in dem, was Nehir schrintet, the Neue Beichule Bismana called Beisa. Nisbala Bais Kulor. What does he identify as Moshe's greatness, as the symbol of Moshe's greatness? The fact that he illuminates his surroundings. That's his greatness. Ve'adraba, geshem dinyan is l'mayla. Not only is it a great thing to be able to influence, touch, and illuminate others, it's actually the greatest thing. It's even greater than a person having their own internal spiritual worth. Just as things are on high, as the that Eibishter's infinite power, which comes from Hashem's essence, that doesn't depend on anything else in order to exist. Where do we find the Eibishter's essence illustrated most powerfully? Dafka in the level of Malchus. In the Esavos von Yesh v'Dav Nifrat, the ability to create something that looks and feels independent. Von Olam es B'Yah, only in the sphere Shalom Mimena, which is something that exists in the lower worlds, not in the 10 spheres of Atzilus. In other words, where do you see Hashem's greatness? Just as the Eibishter is truly independent, does not rely on anything to exist. So where do you see Hashem's greatness expressed? In the creation of things, of beings that feel that they're independent. So there's greater elikus in the Malchus experience than in the Yesod experience. There's greater elikus in the illumination than there is in the self-growth. That's how it is down here. What is the greatest advantage that a person has? If they can share with others, touch others, elevate others. Which, yes, outwardly looks like the person has had to step off their spiritual pedestal in order to achieve this, but it's actually the greatest achievement. And Rashi hints at this too. Why? Because he quotes Rabbi Loi saying that the first step of Moshe's description is his own greatness, and the second is the authority he has of others. Rabbi Yehuda is such a unique individual. He appreciates the value of both realities. Not that Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Yosef, we each one appreciated the value of one reality. He appreciates both. He identifies with the value of a person's own growth represented by the increased height that Moshe had in the first Vayigdal. And he also recognizes the value to be able to have greatness, which allows you to influence others, like Paro appoints him over his home. Why Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Loi? So let's explain more deeply who Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Loi is. We'll compare him to Rabbi Yossi and explain why he sees things differently. The chilek between Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Loi and Rabbi Yossi is the distinction between these two great personalities, Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Loi and Rabbi Yossi, is beides in Yom Madrigos and Spheres HaMalchus. What they have in common is they both represent and live in the reality of Malchus. How do we know that? Because Rabbi Yossi is Gematria Elikim. Rabbi Yossi, the name Yossi has the same Gematria as Elikim. Vashem Elikim Geitef Malchus. That's the divine name that is associated with the production of nature, which is Malchus. On Rabbi Yehuda, the word Yehuda is Mleshein Haidah Ubitul. It's from the word of acknowledgement and surrender and complete bittul. Which is what Malchus is all about. Malchus lesle migar miklum. It doesn't have any identity of its own. It surrenders to the input that it receives from higher and more developed realities. So Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Loi are both Malchus, but different perspectives of Malchus. So, but da achilik zwischen sie. Rabbi Yossi's Visfiras Malchus is Yeredes in Biyah. Rabbi Yossi lives in the reality of how Malchus has already become enclosed within the independent reality known as Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah. On Rabbi Yehuda's Visfiras Malchus is noch in Atzilus, whereas Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi experiences Malchus while it is still incorporated in the oneness of Atzilus. Was a Chelek is in their name. By the way, that's also alluded to in their names, because Rabbi Yossi is Bigematria Elikim. What does that mean? They'll say it means two things. Number one, Aleph says no Shem Elikim u'nit Shem Havaya. The first thing is that Rabbi Yossi only connects with the name Elikim and has no clear connection with the name Havaya. And even his connection with Elikim is not something which is obvious. You have to work it out from a gematria, which implies that it's fundamentally hidden. Whereas the name Yehuda has Yud-Kei Vav-Kei in it, clearly for all to see. And that explains their different perspectives. When you're looking through Rabbi Yossi's eyes, which is the perspective of Malchus already involved in the realities of the created worlds, there you see that the greatest thing you could possibly do is lead, influence, and elevate other people. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi, who is looking from the perspective of Malchus, but with a very clear awareness of the Eibishter, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, beyond the natural order, wie Malchus steht in Atzilus, that's Malchus as it is in Atzilus, so Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi can see both realities. Von der einen Seite ist Malchus verbunden mit Israel im Männer. On the one hand, Malchus is completely connected to the higher spheres, because without them it has nothing of its own, so it's completely reliant on them and therefore completely one with them. And on the other hand, Malchus is completely about providing to the other and bringing to life all the other worlds. Which means to engage with and come down to the level of separate or disconnected beings. Let's say it in different words. Malchus on the one hand has this element of extreme bittul, complete surrender to Hashem, which translates into what a Jewish king is meant to be, somebody who has the most extreme submission to Hashem. When it comes to the Amidah, unlike us, when he bows at the beginning, he has to stay bowed for the entire time. And yet at the same time he has to be a king, who is somebody obviously who has prestige and elevation over the people in order to influence, lead and guide them. That's why it's Dafka Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi. You can speak to both topics, both greatnesses of Moshe Rabbeinu. Side Shlemus Atzmai, his personal development and greatness, which is the Yichud und Dveikus mit Elikus, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu is 24/7 completely connected to Hashem, which puts him at a level that is actually fundamentally beyond anything or anyone else. That's described in Harishan L'Koima, his own personal growth. On Oich is also able to identify the Shlemus in Hashpah, Visnasis of Vazulas, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu is also highly successful as having an influence over other people, and that is Hasheni L'Gdula Sheminei Paral Beisoi, what Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi says, that the second Vayigdal means that he was great in the context of being able to have authority over others, not just others, but over Paro's family as well.